Hello, everybody out there. We are now broadcasting. Oh no, we're buffering. Okay, now I think we are live. We are live now. It's always a little unclear when we're actually live, if people know. However, we're now on the platforms, wherever you're watching. If you're on the Facebook page of Popular Resistance or the Facebook page of Cebu Community Radio here in Portland, Oregon. If you just heard me on the actual radio this morning and now you're seeing me on the Facebook page, it's not an accident. I'm not trying to take over Cebu or anything, but it's just one of those mornings. And we're also broadcasting on YouTube, Twitter, VK, Twitch, and LinkedIn for good measure. And this all goes out afterwards as a podcast if you look for This Week with David Rovics, wherever you get your podcasts. And I'm broadcasting usually on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at this time, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. in England. And it's some really terrible time in the middle of the night for folks in China and Australia. And today I'm very happy to be spending the hour with a man on the south coast of England, who has written a whole lot of books related to the subject of walking. And there's a lot to this subject. And if triarchypress.net is where you can find all sorts of books and essays. And Phil Smith is an eloquent writer and full of insight. And I've just been reading his stuff online. And with no further ado, Phil, it's wonderful to have you here on the internet with me.
Hello, David. Hi.
Hey.
Hi.
I think, as usual, I never know where to start because there's too many places we could start. But I wonder if you could start maybe by talking about what I was just reading in a recent essay of yours, where you refer to the crisis of presence. If we could start with that idea and what it is you're talking about there, just to dive in deep, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm talking about the very long-term effects of what's sometimes been called the spectacle. So, which is in a way the culmination of the effects of mass media, which in itself is kind of was the technological flowering of the mass production of art, if you like, the mechanization of art. And it's kind of reached we don't really know where it's going next, but it's reached what feels like almost like an apotheosis, or whatever the opposite of an apotheosis is, with digitization and the World Wide Web. And part of the effect of that, in a way, is to, I think, radically transform the nature of bodily presence. And it's the sort of transformation that it's possible that one doesn't notice happening, because it's not the sort of thing that will show up in a photograph. It's not the sort of thing that will show up in recorded media. It's probably more going to appear in terms of patterns rather than images, and because of that, it's quite possible to assume that nothing is very much changing with presence. Presence is more an affect. It's more of a feeling. When we talk about being there being once a rather interesting movie called Being There, which was very much a person who almost wasn't there. That is becoming more and more a common feeling, a common sense. People talk about imposter syndrome, and large numbers of people will sort of own up to feeling that they are in some way imposters, that they kind of feel that they do their job, or they fulfill their relationship, or whatever it is, but at the same time many people kind of seem to have a feeling that they're sort of haunted slightly by the sense that it's all a pretense, and that they perform the pretense very well, and everybody else joins in with the pretense, but they're not quite sure if everybody else is pretending to join in with the pretense, you know. And so I think that these are all kind of symptoms of this coming together, really, of this of a very long-term technological development of the way that we share images with each other. I mean, in a way, what we're doing now is pretty extraordinary, you know, and it's been exacerbated by the global pandemic, which has turned millions, if not billions, of bodies into these disembodied heads, you know, where we watch each other.
And is it increasing imposter syndrome, do you think? Is it what is the overall impact, you think, in that this phenomenon we're all experiencing is having in terms of our relationship with the world? I guess that's a fucking huge question. I'm sorry, but what kind of question is that? Jesus.
Let's not mess around with little ones, you know. I mean, the very nature of it is that it's impossible to objectively know this stuff. So because even if one were to, and it's possible that such surveys have happened, even if it was possible to survey, you know, how common it is that people have a feeling of imposter syndrome, we still wouldn't know whether that is actually an affect, whether that's actually what people are feeling, or whether that's just a very successful meme. That story is very successfully going around and reproducing itself. So it's a very, you know, I think very oddly that the way that we deal with and the way that we confront these issues, which appear to be very much the pulling of the objective rug from under everybody's feet, this undermining of accepted objective realities, and the idea that we can just make things up. You know, I mean, you in the States are experiencing this at the moment, and I have been watching a certain amount of these sort of cable-y TV channels which have been springing up since Fox News did its kind of slight sideways step away from Trumpism. That you get the sense that there is this strange kind of sort of empowerment of people to simply make reality up. That, you know, and that areas where people felt happy to fantasize in the past have now sort of spread. So someone who's happy to release videos of themselves becoming disturbed because they think there are ghosts in their house are now happy to share that on the basis that they saw tens of thousands of ballots loaded into the back of their truck, and that those worlds, which in the past would have been very separate, are coming together. Now, how do we live in a world in which those kind of apparently separate discourses are starting to bleed into each other? And the most obvious thing is to step forward and say we need to go back to objectivity. We need to have established truths. We need, you know, to have a sort of a firm credo, and yet we know that actually that kind of firmness in the past has been used against people. It's been used to shore up. It's been used for conservative strategies to protect the power of the minority. So we're in this strange time when somehow we have to find a way to make militant the subjective presence, feeling, you know, being there, returning to the body, things which in the past kind of might have felt very voluntaristic and more prone to going off the straight and narrow, so to speak, may be our only way. And so, for example, just the temptation is in the face of all this kind of mushiness is to kind of try to grab hold of something solid. And so you see even quite militant people grabbing hold of the US Democrats or wanting to listen to the scientists. Now, that's fine, but a lot of scientists have very bad track records in the way that they have dealt with ordinary people, in the kind of things that science has inflicted on ourselves and on the planet. Essentially, we are living in a major sort of technology ecology catastrophe, in a crisis, but because of the fear of the conspiracy world and some of those COVID narratives, people are grabbing onto listening to the science. Well, I mean, I'm not anti-science in any way, shape or form, but as you can't simply hold on to those things as though they are objectivities which are going to sustain you when you look at the history of those, of some of those discourses.
It's not exactly the same, but somewhat similar as people saying, listen to the mainstream media, they're objective. I mean, of course, the part of the problem why people don't believe the mainstream media in the first place is because they've been lying for generations to us, and no small, I mean, with the exception of some wonderful journalists out there, the general, like if you look at most of the media outlets in the United States in 2003, they were all parroting, and also in the UK as well, they were all, most of them, parroting the government line about non-existent weapons of mass destruction, just for example, which kind of,
exactly what I mean. So people suddenly wanting to listen to the BBC, which is fine. There are some good reports and good reporters on there, but at the same time, the BBC broadcasts within a very narrow consensus reality. That there are clearly political figures, even quite close to what can we say, institutional power, who have quite clearly been marginalised by public broadcasting. So I think it's a very difficult and sort of dangerous time in that respect, because it's easy, out of sheer horror at the kind of mess of communication which is happening, and which is also, I think, fueled by either a full awareness or at least a suspicion that it's not all working in one direction. So it's not just that we are consuming certain kinds of imagery and certain kinds of narratives, but there are algorithms, even as we use this technology, that are getting, that are listening to what our words are, that are already preparing the adverts which will connect to our dialogue, that are logging each word that we're using in some way that will feed into somebody else's sort of program so we're very aware that, as well as us trying to deal with this sort of stew of ideas and images and stories, the very machinery that's providing the platforms for that stew is also active itself in trying to get inside our subjectivities, trying to find out what we want before we know what it is that we want.
these are not neutral platforms by any means. And then the control that the algorithms have over what we see, what content we see on platforms like YouTube and Facebook, where people spend so much of their time, it has very little to do with what you want to see or what you are attempting to actually follow. Even if you are being conscious about what you're trying to follow on those platforms, you see what they want you to see, what they think is going to keep you glued, and it's conflict so much of the time. And then people start these arguments where you can see, like, this is a very intelligent person arguing with me, and I know that this person didn't read the article but only read the one paragraph thing on that Facebook promoted to him, and I understand that, but it's really it's insidious how much division it creates. But then one of the things you've written about is how sort of, I guess, conversely, the pandemic has also gotten a lot more people to turn off their computers and their TVs and go outside and take up walking and human contact, and then to some extent some of the behaviors that get painted as antisocial, or like some of the raves and stuff, that also you were writing how there's a positive aspect to the desire that people have to just experience each other.
And I think I don't think we'll really know what the impact has been until we're sort of beyond the pandemic. I think that essentially because there have been these sort of lockdowns, and now the UK has all these different tier systems, which are sort of almost lockdowns, and in some areas it's a bit more free and easy. But essentially, there are these instructions that the government is giving to people, and largely people are following those instructions because they seem to be fairly sensible. There is a small minority of people who feel that it's all a big plan to limit people's freedoms, but I think most people are see it much more as just straightforward. Yes, restrictions, but you don't shout fire in a theatre. There are restrictions that are just common sense, that are just about looking after each other, and are not necessarily state or deep state conspiracies. So but it has been about conforming in many ways. That's been the thing to do in many ways, and so I think a lot of the thinking that's been going on, and a lot of the sort of minor changes to behavior, won't actually manifest. We won't really see that until after a pandemic is over and people are back on the streets and interacting. And it may be that that people will go back to normal. Not that that's possible, but that people will want want to identify a normality, and in that sense, it may be that some of those different ideas, though, that the kind of things that came through when people had more time to think, may just wither away. They may simply be forgotten, or it's possible that there will be a hunger for close connection, that wanting to be close to people and wanting to be close to lots of people will be a very, very powerful force, and that you will see people gathering and sharing in big crowds, in big groups, and that will become hugely valued as a result of it being suppressed. But I don't know how one would predict that. I don't know. I think it's very hard to predict how those sorts of coming together of so many different individual feelings, how that manifests. I'm not sure it's worth trying to predict. So I think at the moment we don't really know how that's playing out. I mean, just subjectively, when certainly when the most severe lockdown was in place in England, or at least where I lived, I was seeing a lot more people walking. Some of that was just out of necessity because people needed to go to the shops, but you also saw a lot of people walking in families and in couples, as well as people walking on their own, partly because you were restricted in who you could meet with anyway, and that certainly felt as though people who didn't regularly walk out that was becoming their entertainment, that was becoming their, and to some degree that I've seen that seems to have continued, that for some people that sort of walking into their area seems to have been sustained. I think that something that I've observed over a long engagement with walking, when you pointed that out in the introduction, is that it's often quite shocking how little people know about the immediate environs of where they live.
Yeah.
That, that in a motor car society, that's much more regimented than people perhaps imagine until they look at it and stand outside it. There are trips to the shops, there are trips to the cinema, there are trips to the football ground or whatever it is, often mostly by motor car, and very little real kind of walking around the local area. And that if people wanted to do something, to go out and visit somewhere, they wouldn't walk half a mile around where they lived. They would get in the car and they would drive to a beauty spot or to a historical thing, or they would go to a museum or a display or something like that. And so I think, I can't be sure, but my guess is that quite a few people who suddenly found that actually walking out was pretty much the only thing that they were allowed to do, because for a long time you weren't supposed to get in your car and drive anywhere. That people may well have discovered that rather shocked to find sort of rather extraordinary things in like 2 blocks away. For example, the city that I live in has more forest within its boundaries than any other in the whole of the United Kingdom, but almost nobody knows that. The people who live right next to the bits of forest that are inside the city know that it's there, but if you only ever drive on the roads, you'll never notice them because they're all in valleys. Because when the city was bombed in the Second World War, the suburbs were very rapidly built to replace the houses that were destroyed, but they didn't build on the valleys because it's harder to build on steep sides. So they built up just on the top, and pretty much a lot of those valleys are still left, and the trees are still there. There's still quite old woodland in those trees, or it was farmland and trees have grown up on them, and so they're hidden. So if you just stay in your car, you'll never ever, you'll see a sort of tree top and you'll think it's a tree in the back of somebody's garden. But if you go down the little path by the side of their house, you'll suddenly find, you can walk for a mile in woodland behind these houses. There are these little kind of pockets of forest, and they're not deserted. In many of them you'll find that there are paths, and you'll meet people walking their dogs or going out to romance or whatever it is that they're up to in there. So there are definitely, in most of them, there are you'll find people wandering around up to something, but most people don't realize that. And I wonder whether a lot of people have, they've walked that extra quarter of a mile and been amazed by what they've found. That within these cities there are caves to be found. There are old ruins. There are old ceremonial arches from the Navy from the 19th century that are just in the middle of housing estates that you will find, but there's no they're not known as being landmarks or monuments. There are no signs up pointing you to them, but if you wander enough, you'll keep finding them. So I don't know. I don't know. I might be romancing it up, and that none of that happened, and that none of it will have any effect. But it's possible that that certain kind of changes in that respect will happen.
And of course, whether they do or not, they should. And I love. I mean, when I first came across some of your writing months ago, or I don't know, maybe it was longer ago, but my memory is not good enough to make the connections if it was years ago. But it just resonated so much with me because I mean, first of all, it's like when you're writing about writing about walking, it's not you're writing about the practice, a sort of a mindfulness practice, as well as a practice of learning about the world around you, on so many different levels. And if you know a little bit of local history, I've always found it, as you write about it, how much you can learn about the surroundings if you just, as you say, get out of your car and walk around. And this is, as a touring musician, it's always been my favorite thing to do. And people often think I'm kind of weird, but like wherever I'm staying, I just want to explore that area, walk by foot, walk all over the place. And wherever I'm playing, I want to explore that area by foot. And I never go to the tourist spots. It's always just some random place I happen to be staying at, whether it's in the city or the suburbs or whatever. And then one of the particularities of that experience of especially in the English countryside, of staying in random places, is that the walks can take you onto private property, and you can keep on walking, which is often not an experience that we have here in the U.S., where there's a lot of forest land that's publicly owned, and plenty of walking you can do on the 10% of the land mass of the U.S. that is national forest land. But when you're walking around otherwise, you often have to watch out for where you're going, and if you're going to get shot. And I wonder if the laws around right of way probably have a huge impact on the society, I'd say, generally, and on this whole practice of rambling, which is relatively popular in England compared to a lot of societies.
Yes, and I mean, and the public footpaths which is what you're talking about, are an extraordinary resource, and are revealing in incredible ways in their own right. There are attempts at the moment to erode that to some degree. There's a sort of deadline for registering a lot of these footpaths. There are a lot of people who have very active and have been very active over decades in terms of protecting those rights of way across. There's been some erosion that myself and people I've walked with have noticed just because of the COVID pandemic, where certain sort of people have put up little signs directing you around their property. Or with the excuse of it being, or even a couple of times I've actually found where people have actually they've actually made alternative footpaths to take you around, because I mean, these are quite unusual in a way, because some of these footpaths actually go through people's gardens, like you are literally walking past their sort of front room sort of thing.
And I remember Madonna was one of the people involved on the wrong side of that issue because of paparazzi coming to her property and stuff, right?
Yeah, I think there have been one or two sort of famous celebrities who tried to stop it on that basis. I've come across a few examples recently where that's been happening, where they've used COVID, and saying we don't want people walking through, which is, I mean, it might be that they are worried, but to be honest, there's no genuine possibility of transmission through walking through somebody's garden. But no. So anyway, I've been a snitch, and we've reported those to the footpath officers. So hopefully, once it's over, those footpaths will be properly returned, but those little battles happen all the time. Farmers plow up footpaths at the sides of fields, and sometimes it might be pure clumsiness and not note, they put somebody in who doesn't know that that's a footpath, and it may happen by accident, and sometimes it's malevolence. They don't want people passing, and sometimes people may have had a bad experience. Someone's let their dog out and it's savaged a sheep, or something. So not all people who walk in using the footpaths that are always, doing the right thing. So those little conflicts happen, but the basic right to walk across those footpaths, it's so revealing. So recently, myself and I've been working with my colleague Helen, and we sometimes make work as a little unit, Crab and Bee, and we've been exploring some of the land either side of the Tamar, and we were doing that during the sort of lockdown period when it wasn't possible to get very far. So we were sort of working our way up, and that landscape, a lot of it is a post-industrial landscape. Now it looks, some bits of it look extraordinary. They look like sort of rainforest. Some of the bits of the sides of the river, quite steep cliffs, extraordinary vegetation. Some of it's quite sort of strange and overhanging masses of creepers and whatever. But these were industrial sites. There were mines all up the side of the river, copper, lead, and even silver. There were silver mines that were royal mines that were owned by the crown for a long time, until I think the 17th century, and then they sort of privatized them. But for a long time they were owned by the crown, and you can see where the old quays used to be, and some of them that you can actually still see the actual quays themselves are in place. In some places they've pretty much disappeared, but the creeks are still there, and bringing together those quays with the mines, there is this network of hollow lanes. These and unless you really are watching out carefully for them, it's very easy to miss them. Certainly if you're in a motor car, even down one of the small lanes, you need to watch out, because you'll often just pass them. If you're going at speed, you will not see them. And so they're these quite narrow paths, but they're sunken into the ground very often. Sometimes they're right down to the actual bedrock, which can make them quite difficult to walk on. But they were the routes that connected the mines to the quays, and also and things would have been going the other way. So sometimes you're in the middle of nowhere, and there's like 3 cottages or 4 cottages around the crossroads, and one of them is a forge, and you can see that the forge used to have a little shop. You can see the wooden window that where they clearly what was happening was that people were coming from the little farmsteads, and they were buying their whatever they needed, for like a little I guess it was a mixture of a grocer's and a sort of hardware store, and that shop would have been serviced by the goods that were coming off the boats, coming up the river and coming up these little hollow lanes, and then and were servicing that. And what's amazing is that network is all still there. It's almost none of it has been removed. People kind of walk it a bit. You can tell from the footprints in the ground, that they are still occasionally, but it's very quiet. I mean, probably we probably walked about 30 of these lanes, and probably in all the time we've met like 2 or 3 people coming up them.
And they've been covered with vegetation, I imagine. You have to look out for them. Because
they sort of protect. They've often got walls, either natural walls of stone, it's been cut into the ground itself. The base of it is very often is bedrock, so nothing's going to actually grow on the bed directly on the bedrock. It's often swept, often water sweeps down it, so that kind of keeps it relatively clear, and people are walking it enough. I mean, they are, they're rights of way, they are public footpaths, and so enough people are walking it to keep it clear. So you're not having to fight your way through that. You could still the actual flooring is sometimes a bit uneven because water has eroded it. But in terms of size, you could still take a wagon down there. You could still,
Wow.
and and sometimes you can see that people have been riding horses along them as well. But you could take a wagon down there. Still, they're not in any way obstructed, and they're sort of like, I mean, some of them are probably very, very old. They're certainly hundreds of years old, and they may actually have been walked longer than that. But they're also a little feeling for the future. There's a little sense of that they're just sort of waiting for us to bring back the local connections, the connections of how we make food and how we make things, and how we then share those things, how those things become, how those foods and those things become distributed. And it's almost like there's this localized web of connections which is sort of waiting to be brought back to life. So they're very old, but they could be also kind of futuristic.
Yeah, and when you walk them, you see them. I mean, you see the history. You envision what was going on, as you probably feel like you at times teleported to other periods when you're daydreaming, walking around in the woods and imagining what it might have been like.
And sometimes there are actually things that take you there. So I can think of one which wasn't very pleasant, to be honest with you. On one of those was finding an old mine. It was right. The path took you right deep down, very damp and dank, and it was very muddy underfoot. But there was still the huge chimney from the old mine was still there, and quite a lot of the mine buildings, and you could see actually sort of down into the mouth of the mine. You wouldn't want to go down there. It was not a safe place to be, but you could see over into this drop, and it didn't have a good feeling at all. You really felt that this ripping of this stuff out of the earth had there was nothing very sentimental or nostalgic about it, and also the way it had been treated, it had not been recovered. There'd been no attempt to sort of patch the wound, so to speak. So it really felt like you were walking through a wound. And then another occasion recently, just sort of going down again one of these things, and then just finding a little holy well in the side of the path, very small, little, no sign that anybody was taking any notice of it. There were no, some of these holy wells people go to and they leave flowers or they leave little trinkets or whatever. Nothing of that at all. It was just sort of sitting there and unless you kind of sort of knew what it was,
what is that, a holy well?
It's a well, a spring. It's where water is coming up through the ground, and it will have been at some time seen as not simply a water source, but as having some significance.
I see. And a spring in English, a well is not something people made, but is when water is coming out of the ground. Because a well here in American is something people made.
Yes. That's an interesting distinction. So I mean, there are wells in England. There have been wells that have been drilled down through, but normally, particularly like a holy well is essentially a spring. It's where, and because of some quality, often there was a quality in the water, which, whether it was true or not, would have some sort of healing property or some sort of almost magical property. So, for example, recently visited a well called St. Nonna's Well. Well, it doesn't appear to be any real St. Nonna. The Nonna thing might mean there's Latin for fate, or it might have it's often you also get 9 wells, so there's a word there which we've lost, which gets given to a personality or whatever. But that particular well that St Nonna's Well was seen as a place for treating psychiatric illnesses. So so people were taken there to take that water, and as some sort of curative. And there's an interesting thing that because we found like a 19th century engraving of this well, and on top of it is an oak tree that's growing out sort of out of the top of the well. The well is it's sunk into the hillside. It's an incredibly steep hillside, and the oak tree is sort of growing out the top of it. But quite a young oak tree in the thing. When we went back again, there's another young oak tree growing. So like 100 more or plus years. Somehow there's still an oak tree, but it's very clearly not the same oak tree as was in the picture. So there's you get this sort of sense of the continuity of those things, and that is a well that people take notice of. Again, it's quite difficult to find, but people do seek it out, and it is the most extraordinary position. So it's high up on the hillside, and you sort of come down some steps from a road to it, and then where the well is itself, if you sort of turn, if you're facing the well but you turn back, the land just falls away, not quite sheer but almost sheer, a long way down. It's a green field down to a stream at the bottom, which is hidden in some trees. It's a long way down, and then it rises up just as steeply on the same side. And there is a certain feeling, as you turn, and you just get the sense of this sort of wedge of air that's kind of caught in this valley. It does give you a sort of feeling. Now, whether that shaping in the land has some sort of therapeutic, quality, just because of the way that you feel yourself sort of placed in that landscape by that view. I mean, I don't know, I'm not a psychologist, but there is definitely an effect that happens when you visit some of these places, and the way where exactly they're positioned, and give you another example, with my colleague Tony Whitehead visiting some rather extraordinary caves, which have, one of which was a medieval chapel. There's nothing there. Well, there are tiny ruins, and this was a chapel that seemed to have been destroyed for worshipping the wrong things. So it's very similar to the destruction of a chapel in the north of the county, which was destroyed for the worship of, I think it was wicked Eve and disobedient and lustful Diana, I think it was. So there's clearly sort of something slightly off about if you stand in the mouth of that cave and look out, it frames the mouth of the cave frames the hill on the other side of the valley, and on the top of that hill is an old earthwork from the Dumnonian people from 2,000 years before. It's like a sort of serpentine thing. And in the middle of that 2,000-year-old earthwork are two burial mounds from the people before the Dumnonians. So they were building around burial mounds that were already 1,000 years old when they built them, and that's all framed within this cave, and when you get that sense of people thinking and planning their we're going back to presence now, their presence in the landscape, where they are not just, their presence is not just about me. It's not where am I here, it's how is everything in relationship to everything else, how do things sit with each other. And that's what there seems to be an attention to, and in a way that's where the obsession with screens. We don't really know where we are. I mean? I might look as if I'm sitting in the closet, but I could be anywhere. You've got a sort of a back behind you. You know, we're not really placed, are we? We're just voices sort of wandering around in the ether, really. And so, although I'm always very happy to engage, you know, using digital apparatus to talk, in the end, the point of is to drive people away from the screens and away from the digital, and to get into the narrow lanes and to get up onto the hills and start to not to find themselves. I mean, I know you were talking about mindfulness in relation to walking, but and there is, I think, there is some therapeutic and some psychological value to it, but in a way that comes by not thinking too much about that, and just trying to actually look to see the way that things relate to each other, you know, both historically, but also what's happening now, so that there's a loop of time and thinking in the future. You know, those old lanes, I think, are pointing us to a different future. They're not just historical artifacts. They're actually, you know, they're way markers into where we might be.
What were you and Helen doing in Sicily recently?
Oh no, Scilly.
Huh?
Yeah. So
Scilly. What's Scilly? Oh, that place is it's in England.
Yeah. Well, it's not quite in England. It's so Scilly. The Scilly Isles are they are okay. So there's an old story. So you've got the southwest of England with Cornwall, like a sort of toe, a little bit like Italy kicking Sicily, with like a toe at one end. And then there's an old story, which is that there was a land called Lyonesse, which is now under the sea. And the last little bit of it are these islands that so are off the end of Cornwall, but they're I'm not quite sure how many miles. It takes you about, what was it? Is it 3 or 4 hours on the boat to get to them? So they're a fair way off, and they're very small little places. And we were invited to a conference about island culture. So there were people from all sorts of different islands who were to come, and we basically talked about the work that we were doing, and then we created a walk, a kind of performance walk for the conference delegates. And there's an extraordinary place there are various islands, and we were on the main island is St Mary's. There's an extraordinary place there, Penninnis Head, where the natural rock formations are just I mean, it looks like there's like a giant pushing themselves out of the ground. You know, there are various sort of extraordinary shapes, but perhaps the most remarkable is that is what looks like hundreds of figures walking off into the sea.
Wow.
And they're walking off into the west. It's very much like Finisterre. It's and St Mary's was at one time an Isle of the Dead. It was where people actually sailed their dead from the mainland and buried them. And I could well believe that they might bring them to that point, because literally the stones look like they're walking off into the west. It's most remarkable place. So yeah, and we created a walk, a sort of life and death walk for the delegates, and we took them, and they ended at Penninnis Head looking. Well, some of them then went and ran on the rocks, which was all very exciting and scary. But we took them to that place, and then essentially created a sort of, hopefully, a kind of headspace for them to then, you know, to just be in that space for half an hour and just to find their own meanings in it, you know.
What were some of the commonalities that you found people were finding in each other from island cultures? I mean, one of the things that occurs to me that my wife is from Japan, and at least I don't know how. Thinking about it, I'm not sure if this is necessarily the norm, but I think it is in many cases that the idea of crossing a border on land is very strange. For at least for if you're from Japan and many other islands, that's the island. It's one sort of relatively homogeneous place, and yeah, you have to leave the island to go to other places.
Yeah, and also, I mean, essentially, the Scilly Islands is like a little archipelago. So the commonality is something which is linked by water. Helen, I think, the other day mentioned that because the River Tamar sits between Devon and Cornwall, and the common way of saying that is that the River Tamar separates Devon and Cornwall, but actually, this is Helen, not me. It joins, it brings together Devon and Cornwall, and I think that's very much the feeling. I think in the archipelago is that they're not divided by the sea. The sea is actually what holds them and what joins them, and then you've got a different. You begin to see the world slightly differently, and I think that's possibly common to a lot of islanders, that the islands are not utopias. A lot of utopian writing either built a wall around a city and made it perfect, or they put it on an island and made it perfect, and the island was separated from the rest of the world. But actually, I think for many people who live on islands, that the water connects. The water is how things arrive. It's how they take things out. It's people coming and going. It's not this defensive bulwark against the rest of the world. And once you're talking about looking at the history of these of places, you very quickly find out, if you spend a little bit of time paying attention to the longer term histories of these islands that seem to be in the middle of nowhere. That's how a lot of people would regard them now. They're yes, somewhere to go on holiday with, but not really important culturally. But actually, it's very often on these little islands that 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, were the really important religious monasteries, the colleges. That there were really important sort of cultural centres, and there was much more travel. That people tend to think that it was only when aeroplanes started or transatlantic liners, but the reality is that I think that an ingot of tin from Cornwall, 4,000-year-old ingot, was found in Israel recently. So that gives you an idea of what the trade connections were all that time ago. So and that is true of all these places, that they were much more connected than we imagine, and that actually colonialism actually was when the barriers started being put up.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think so. So there's this Columbus and all this discovering, but they weren't discovering at all. They knew where they were going, and they were going there to occupy, and they were going there to invade, and they were going there to exploit. But prior to that, there had been trade all across the oceans of the world that were, but you have to forget that in order to create the illusion of the so-called virgin territory, the land without a people, that you can go to these places and it's all just wild,
And then, of course, if you even without looking at all the analyzing the soil from thousands of years ago, or finding the 4,000-year-old coins and stuff like that, all you have to do is look at the development of languages like Plattdeutsch, for it just to take a European example, and this was a language that was spoken all along the whole coastal region around the North Atlantic, and clearly because people were trading together, or like other trade languages, they were based on people traveling by sea routes along the sides, the coastal areas of continents, and then the Polynesian. Wow, the traveling of the Polynesians.
Yeah. Reading
biggest traveling people of the world for so long.
Yeah.
What is zombie walking, Phil?
So how old was I? think I was about 19. I think I was about 19, and I must have been back in my home city, which is Coventry. I think during possibly actually no, it was a little bit. I might have just graduated, but I was, for some reason anyway, I'd gone back to see the family, and there was a horror movie, The Dawn of the Dead was on, and I decided I'd go and see it. And I was very shocked by it because although there's a lot of comedy in that movie, it's for its time, well, for any time, it's quite visceral, and I think I was more used to sort of sitting up on a Friday night watching sort of old Universal horrors or something like that. I wasn't quite expecting the intensity of it, and it had quite a big impact just sitting and watching it. It was in a double bill with a ridiculous thing called the giant spider invasion, which was basically somebody under a big carpet moving around, so that I'd rather drop my defenses due to that. I came out into the Coventry sunshine. I think work had just, people had been sort of knocked off, and the shops were just closing and people were going home, and I just saw all these people trudging home after work, and all looking a bit exhausted. And they did look like zombies, it was like this vision. It was a bright sunny day, but people were tired and walking back. And I very much picked up at that moment that it wasn't just an exploitation bit of nonsense, but it sort of rammed home that there is a social commentary in there, that it was a film made by somebody who's trying to say something about consumerism, about hedonism, about media control, about irresponsible media. There's a lot of different things happening about the nature of police and their relationship to the projects. There's a lot of stuff in that movie. I didn't know anything about George Romero. I didn't know anything about it. I thought I was just going for a bit of a, waste an afternoon, and sit and, take a few tins of beer in with me and just lose myself for a couple of hours. And ever since that time, I just got interested in the horror movie, but particularly zombie movies, as kind of very obvious metaphors for society. I remember reading a critic once who said, well, if you think that the zombie is if you think your critical analysis of the zombie movie is that this is about the alienation of the laboring worker, that isn't a metaphor. That's in the movies. That's that's what the movies actually show. That you don't need to have any interpretation of it. It's just that's just what it is. And so I just got interested in that. And then eventually I thought I've really got to sort of write something, about this properly. So I wrote the zombie walking book. Because there's two sides to it. I think on the one hand, the zombie movie, and I'm talking about the modern one. I'm not talking about the old Caribbean-based voodoo zombie. That's a different thing altogether, really. Talk about the post-Romero zombie. And on the one hand, yes, it is this vision of alienation, of kind of robbing people of their individuality, but at the same, and very morbid. At the same time, the zombies are more alive than anybody else. They're they have extraordinary desires. And they don't hold back. They go for it. If they want something, they're very desire driven, and even when bits of them are dropping off, they still keep going. So there's a tremendous life force, weirdly, in the dead in these movies. So I suppose what I then kind of worked that up to was a way of walking, not pretending to be a zombie and not sort of but having that mythos in your head as you're walking. So you're actually starting to actually see the world through the mirror, through the looking glass of the ideas that are in zombie movies. That social criticism, that idea about the sort of two sides of collectivity, if you like. On the one hand, the way that consumerism turns everybody into buying the same three things, but also what happens when people get together in crowds. Very often the zombie succeeds because there's 200 of them, and they become this relentless force. Even though they can't run, they can only walk, they become this relentless force because
collective action.
Exactly. So there's this ambiguity in the zombie, and so it was about walking with those ideas, having those ideas in mind as a way to kind of interrogate the world and to place yourself in it. Now, somebody I gave that book to somebody the other day, and it was someone who's actually recently had some quite serious health issues and has had to be shielding during lockdown, during the pandemic, and he said that he found it quite a hard read, now that he wasn't quite as fit as he had been. And I have to say that I sympathize with that I find that now I'm sort of moving into the older bit of life. I find that I'm less drawn to it, because I think part of that, the zombie thing, is that the morbidity of it, you set your own liveliness against it. It's almost like you're testing yourself, you're pushing yourself against that contrast. But as you get a little bit older, you don't it's in you.
You no longer aspire to be a zombie.
I don't need a film to have that problem. You've got it yourself.
Before we go, Phil, do you have any favorite zombie movies from the past few years? There's been a lot of them.
I always get the title of this wrong. I think is it The Girl with All the Gifts? I think is that right? I think
I haven't seen that one.
I think it came out just under 5 years ago, or maybe a little bit less than that. Rather nicely made, not at all falling into the usual stereotypes. What set it apart? Well, Glenn Close plays a leading role and plays it very well in it. But what sets it apart is that it's looking sort of beyond the usual mythos. So it's actually the virus is a much more ecological one. So if you listen very carefully, in most zombie, if they have a backstory, some of them it just sort of happens. But if they have an actual backstory, it tends to be that something arrived from outer space, some spore, something came in off a satellite or something. It tends to be that although they don't make a lot of it, very often the zombie movie is actually an alien invasion movie, actually. But that's all. But this is different. The virus this time is coming in from the ecology. It's actually something that's happening in the environment itself, and eventually the sort of humanity gives way, and a sort of a new children come through who are essentially plant life children. They look like children, but they're actually and so one surviving human is sort of left, and she sort of locks herself into an institution, and she was a teacher. She was teaching these children, and she locks herself in so she can, because if she goes out among them, they'll eat her. But she teaches them. She carries on being their teacher, and they come to her. But the spores have just gone everywhere. And I thought, well, I like that. I think the there's you see it everywhere, but there's a poster in the window, near where I live, which says there is no planet B.
Yeah.
I think there is a planet B. I think there's a planet A1, which is the Anthropocene, where humans pretty much destroy the planet and pretty much wipe it out. There's a planet A2, which is where the same dreadful humans who somehow miraculously heal the planet, and everything carries on, and whatever. But for me, planet B is where the unhuman things have a much bigger say, that humans don't have very much say in it at all, and that the unhumans create a planet which we won't really recognize, and which we're going to have a lot of trouble sort of working out what's likely to happen and what our place is in it. So rather than and this is the problem with the whole Anthropocene idea, that this is the mark that humans have left. Well, that attitude is kind of part of the problem. It's the fact that we think we're marking it, that we think we can save it, whereas actually it's probably something else which is going to be the real actors in the future. And that for me is the planet B. And I think that's what I liked about that film, was that it sort of respected that through a silly horror movie, but through a silly horror movie, it kind of respected that actually it's not all up to humans, whether collectively or individually. It's actually going to be about looking at how not where you sit, but where everything sits in relation to everything else.
Yeah, including the microplastic. Yeah, wonderful, Dr. Phil Smith.
Everything we do in the future, we do with microplastics. That is, they are our collaborators from now on. They're never going to go away, or not as long as there are humans around, because they're inside and outside. Yeah,
some things we can be sure of.
Yeah.
It's been great talking to you. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Phil.
Well, thank you, David, and thanks for asking me. It's been nice to spend a little time in the closet talking across the ocean with you.
Yes, exactly. A very accurate description of what you've been doing for the past hour.
Okay.
Take care. I'll talk to you again.
Yeah. All the best.
Bye. You too. Bye. And thanks, everybody, for joining in to this discussion with Dr. Phil Smith there on the south coast of England. And to you, I highly recommend his books and essays, which you can find if you go to triarchypress.net. And I'll be back at some point next week with more broadcasting, and probably before then with a song or two. But anyway, until then, you can find all of these discussions archived in various places, including at youtube.com/drovix, or in podcast form if you look for This Week with David Rovix wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. Remember, don't pay the rent. Mutual aid will get us through. Trust your neighbors. Talk to you